Hello everybody, I'm Gan. Today, Merritt's been writing a story. He's 16,000 words in and has gone between the subjects of nautical horror, lobsters, and psychology, all the way back to the psychological effects of being stuck on a boat. God help us all.
As I was saying, rude, by the way. So here we all are. This is probably like the low light and the simultaneous highlight of the whole thing. 13 people crammed into this open top 40-foot cutter just like sardines. So I get up, clamber out. I'm fully trapped under this tarpaulin being punched in the face by the fucking rain pooling on top of it because we set it up like a bunch of retards. And so I go pee off the back of the boat, as you do, and the water starts glowing.
Right. Very good. I hope from that you can gather the importance of good storytelling. As role players, this is something that we all need to appreciate. Today on Tuning Fork, we're going to be discussing long-term RP stories, whether these be guild campaigns or smaller, more intimate experiences.
So clearly today is an episode, you put emphasis on the good. I heard that.
Mm-hmm.
An episode on storytelling. Specifically, how to make the most of your opportunities for it. So to start with, I think it would do to state that Gan and I are particular proponents of the interpersonal drama type of role-playing. We don't generally find role-play combat entertaining. That's correct for me to say for you as well, Gan?
There's nothing more exciting than typing up paragraph-long emotes followed by completely random dice rolls to determine the outcome of a life or death situation.
Of course, because not like any of us are mature enough to handle our own character's limitations.
No,
we need the dice rolls. So, I'm resisting the urge to tangentiate all over the place like I did before. Regardless, with that in mind then, I think we should begin with our own model for how we achieve the most out of our roleplays.
Yes, so as Merritt said, we're essentially into interpersonal drama in whatever situation we're in. Now, just because you're going on a long-term story that's based around killing some monster or finding something, it doesn't mean that you can't have drama between the characters. And by drama, just like to clarify, we don't mean it necessarily in like a soap opera sense. All we mean is a situation where there is tension and conflict between the characters that doesn't necessarily relate to the central objective of the quest. Now, again, you can see this in lots of great stories. Like, look at Lord of the Rings. Got the relationship between Sam and Frodo, or even something as superficial as the conflict between Gimli and Legolas, which gets resolved over time. This all constitutes drama. I would also like here to reference a tabletop role-playing game which you probably haven't heard of called Hillfolk. They've got something called a drama system, the aim of which is to establish pre-existing relationships between the different characters so that you can have a system where the characters have potential ways that they can conflict with each other, ways that they can agree, objectives to gain from each other, etc., etc. Now, I'm not going to be referencing again, however, I just thought it was right to
throw that
essentially... to throw that out there and give some credit to the guys over there of tabletop role-playing by taking your typical Dungeons and Dragons setup and adding what they like to call a drama system, where before you start, you write down your character and their relationships to the other characters, and you set up essentially, I'll just go back a bit. They've got something called a drama system, the aim of which is to establish pre-existing relationships between the different characters so that you can have a system where the characters have potential ways that they can conflict with each other, ways that they can agree, objectives to gain from each other, etc., etc. Now, I'm not going to be referencing again, however, I just thought it was right to
throw that
essentially, to throw that out there and give some credit to the guys over there.
We're not sponsored to say that. We just stumbled across it, I think, in a Lindy Beige video. Anyway,
yeah, it was in the Lindy Beige video. Yeah. Not sponsored by him either.
And we're not saying that when you start out with your roleplay that you need to write down what the characters want from one another. But with all of this fresh in our heads, let's get into the muffins. The characters. By our model of a story, the most important thing to start with are the characters that are going to end up on this journey or situation, whatever you want to call it, they're going to end up in it together. And we want to make sure that they're going to end up there in a believable manner. So what I mean is, if the stakes are low, like, Gan, you know how there's nothing to just stop them from walking away when the conflict arises.
Yeah. There needs to be something that the characters are invested in, I suppose. And like on that note, it's also really important that the characters again, I feel like this is something that people don't consider when they're setting up a campaign. Like, they just consider what the story is going to be, whereas we think that it's really important that people actually look at the character composition. So what you need with a good character composition is, firstly, you need sufficient similarities so that people aren't just like having a giant fight all the time, because that's not a very productive way to have a journey. But you also need sufficient differences to cause some degree of conflict. Now, this is established through relationships. Now, when I say relationships, I don't necessarily mean like sex type things, like Merit and
No one was
the
thinking
dogs.
that. No, nothing with dogs.
Nothing. Okay, right. I won't make any comments about that again. Anyway, it's basically when one character has a connection with another character. This can be something romantic, or it could be something familial, or it could be more of a rivalry or an enemy type situation. Characters need some sort of connection through which they can express conflict and through which they can express similarity. Because if the characters really don't care about each other at all, either in a positive or negative sense, it's really just going to be, hey, let's all get together and go on a big adventure, and that's just boring. I mean, you wouldn't write a fantasy novel where all the characters just agreed with each other all the time, now would you? Example of this, from our experience, is my demon hunter called Andalis and Merit's demon hunter called Laria would go, we did sort of lots of RP with them a while back. And rest in peace, Laria. And they're good examples of characters that have similarities, but also differences to cause conflict. So obvious similarities, they're both Illidari, they're both elves, etc., etc. But they've also experienced a lot of hardship in the past and have similar attitudes to authority in some ways, I think. But also they have lots of differences. So Andalis is quite arrogant aristocrat, whereas Laria is sort of an impoverished person that comes from a really tough background. And that is one difference that they have to overcome to establish a positive relationship. Now, if that difference wasn't there, then they'd just be having a good time the whole time. And there's no fun in a story where the characters just agree with each other.
Keep in mind that these two characters also started off with their differences very much more pronounced. So if you're in a roleplay with somebody that you know and you want to start a journey together, say if your characters have already had their differences explored and have found some common ground, I think that's a really good place to start. The best teams for a roleplay story, I think in me and Garn's experience, is a team of 3 to 4 people. That's kind of the best number. Once you have the characters you're going to use, you want to decide on the plot and the shape of the story. Garn?
So we don't mean laying out like a 50-point structure as much as Merit would want to do that. What we basically mean is that before you start, it's probably a good idea to discuss the basic plot line of how things are going to happen. You can plan it in more detail if you want, but our main point here is that if you can establish concretely what the events of the story are going to be in terms of where are we going, what are we doing, what are we going to fight, then you've got that boring stuff, in our opinion, out of the way. So you can focus more on how your characters are going to react to those situations. Now, again, on that subject, it might be a good idea to discuss and think about how your characters might react to these situations. Obviously, it's important to maintain sort of a degree of spontaneity and surprise. But giving some thought to how your character might react to different situations is a good way to make the RP more fun, because you'll react in a more credible way to the situations because you've given some thought to them.
Yeah. And so this might be somewhere where Garn and I may diverge a little bit. To anybody listening, this is best left to your discretion about how you wish to develop a story, and to your roleplay partners, and that you compromise to a necessary degree to make it enjoyable for everybody. But if you've seen our previous episode, you'll know that I'm a bit more of like a bottom-up developer of my characters. I like to have the groundwork, I like to dig the hole, plant the seed, and let it grow.
I'm not as planned, essentially. I go for what we call a top-down approach, and if we're going with the metaphor of the tree, it's like I chuck a bunch of leaves in the air and hope that some branches attach to them.
Randomly decided traits on your characters that work out really, really well, that you like to stick together.
Yeah, so just like, again, if we're talking about the context of a campaign, so I sort of like to live on the edge a bit. In the context of like a journey, I won't really give much thought to how my characters are going to react to situations. And the characters' reactions are often spontaneous. So an example that came up in our last episode was when my Tauren, Garn, and I'm called Garn, and no, I'm not named after my Tauren, the situation is essentially that Garn is going on a trip through Ungoro Crater with Merritt and two people we were role-playing with at the time. Now, I decide that Garn is sad. Why is Garn sad? I don't know. Turns out there's this whole thing going on with his wife where she left him and they spend a lot of time in Ungoro Crater. Now, I didn't know that, and that just sort of came up in the context of the journey, and it ended up being a good sort of spur for drama. And I didn't abuse it, and we'll get to how you can not be too intrusive with sudden plot points at that later. Also, there was this whole thing about him being sad about some dwarves and that whole like gnome thing.
Incident.
I'm not going to discuss that here.
Okay.
But yeah, I think the good thing about spontaneity is that it can make things more entertaining if you don't have too much of it. So I suppose in the context of a role play, I'm going to be the one providing the sort of the random shit and the elements of strange spontaneity that keep everyone on their toes a little bit.
Yeah. And I guess we're in concordance there, because I'm not saying that we restrict it all down. I'm not necessarily so planned as to be restrained, and you're not too random to be chaotic. So a significant note to DMs here. I understand that at first glance, the idea that I've put forward of taking on this pseudo-playwright's role might seem like very restrictive, and I'm definitely not saying that it's beneficial to write out the entirety of the story. Not at all like where you detail every character's response to things before you do it, and then try and fulfill it like a play. It's a little bit more loose. In my own experience, there's something to be said for how realistic the interactions feel when you allow them to grow from the groundwork that you put in place beforehand. It's a top-down, bottom-up hybrid.
Just a note, Merritt seriously likes realism in his characters, to the extent that on Merritt the Death Knight, he refuses to do RP, like he refuses to participate in the trope that is tavern RP, because Merritt wouldn't want to be in the tavern. And like, so that's sort of what we're dealing with here in terms of realism. But still, I can respect his respect for realism. But an example of what he means, because it's a really good point, in terms of realism being important and having some like a shell to operate in. So again, if we're talking about Garn, the character who likes to do spontaneous things, when I think about spontaneous things to do on Garn over the course of a campaign, it's not just let's come up with a completely random thing that makes no sense. I try to have sort of boundaries in the context of the character, and I try not to operate outside of those, because as soon as you do, you start breaking down the realism, etc. And it's also important in that context to not be so completely random and outside of your boundaries that you end up changing the entire plot of the story. Your individual developments, the character points that you come up with, should alter the character landscape rather than the plot.
Yeah. So just before we move into, what you do after you've got your plot down, I just want to say, so I think what we're kind of putting forward here about the design of the plot is the ideal put forward by a Russian writer from the 20th century named Vladimir Nabokov. And so you witness the plot of a lot of his stories through the thoughts of a flawed narrator, like sometimes just an absolute madman. The absolute madman. And in that way, the plot takes somewhat of a significant backseat to the actual characters themselves, because you have to begin wondering if what you're seeing is true. And so that can translate into roleplay, or to like roleplay writing for me, or for us, as writing out the plot somewhat specifically, having the events in place, and then bounding the improvisations to the thematic element of the characters and their interactions, because that's what me and Garn want, right? Yeah. So we want to get to these thematic points. If you've seen our last video, you'll heard us talk at length about that. And I guess for us, or for me at least, the way to do that is to get through the character drama, to explore the role that the character plays. And so I'm aware this won't be for everybody, but that's my process. And of course, to DMs, like I said, be willing to compromise. Now that you've got your plot, or the general framework of what you're going to be operating within, you want to sort out the relationships of your characters and their sub-objectives. So Garn, would you like to explain this?
Yeah, so relationships and sub-objectives, what do I mean by that? So I've already spoken a little bit about what I mean by relationships, so I won't explain what those are again. But I would like to just touch on the fact that in terms of relationships, and this is something that came up a bit in Lindy Beige's video on Hillfolk, characters should have sub-objectives in relation to each other. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that each character should have some sort of ulterior motive. Now, by that, I don't mean something that's necessarily like malevolent or evil. Like that's the idea we get when we hear ulterior motive, and it definitely shouldn't be something that detracts from the main journey. But let me give an example of what I mean. So, in terms of Garn, the Tauren, his sub-objective for going on the journey was to find his wife. Now, I didn't actually work out that was his sub-objective until after the fact, but that's not the point. I could have come up with it beforehand. It didn't detract from the entire journey. It's not evil, but he's got another objective. It doesn't even necessarily need to be about finding someone. It could be maybe you're really in love with someone in the group and you want to win their affection. Maybe you really hate someone in the group and you want to basically not necessarily kill them, but you want to screw them over a little bit.
I think the way you can describe it as well is just that it's some goal of the character that colors their behaviors throughout the plot beyond just the happenstance.
Exactly. It gives those interactions color, especially when the sub-objectives start to clash, because characters aren't going to admit their sub-objectives to each other, which means that when you start getting conflict in relation to each other and you don't know what the conflict is because of, it means that the drama gets really compelling. What I'm referencing here is an Eastern European drama theorist called Stanislavski. Now, his sort of theory around sort of playwriting and drama and acting was that characters should have super objectives. So a character should have an overwhelming goal, and then that translates into more specific objectives for the specific scene that they're in. So in the context of RP, when we're talking about theme, you can translate theme. In other words, we've spoken in previous episodes about how each character should have a central concept that they are built around. That can be viewed as like a super objective, some grand overarching goal. And then your sub-objective for this particular journey should be an extension of your super objective, which then allows you to use whatever journey you're on as a method for character development.
It generally wants to be decided, I think, by the character's personality, or like by their overarching super objectives that relates to their overall story direction, that you can then draw from that into it. Also, I think that when you say that you get these super objectives that tie them to the story much more effectively, it adds a lot of credit and verisimilitude to the character's reasoning for being there, because I feel like a lot of the time my roleplay journeys have felt a little shoehorned, because my question is just like, why are my characters here?
Yeah, why are we doing this? Like, we're in a guild together, so we need to go on a journey, but why am I going on this journey?
Yeah. And like, you want them to begin interacting with one another beyond just the scope of what the task demands. And I think that goes to what you were saying about inter-character objectives as well.
Yeah, so just to go into a bit more detail in terms of sub-objectives in relation to the different characters. So you can have your overarching sub-objective in terms of like, what do you want to get out of this journey? But also you can have, or you should have, sub-objectives relating to the different characters on the journey. So this is something that Lindy Page sort of brought up in his video on like the Hillfolk drama system. But essentially what it is that you should imagine like a web in your head, and your character is connected to the other characters through like a line of drama. And what that line consists of is some thing that you want to get out of that character. It could be a very literal thing, like maybe you want to steal someone's very special ex, or like ex as in like standing in for a thing. I don't mean like an ex-girlfriend or something. Or it could be something less literal, like maybe you have a particular desire relating to a particular character, maybe you've got a particular emotion like love or hatred or something, but essentially what that's doing is it's giving your character a motivation to interact with the other characters in such a way that establishes drama, which makes things more entertaining for everyone.
And I guess going back to what you said about inter-character objectives, just to provide an example of this, we can use the example of Andalis and Laria, wherein the two of them saw each other as a path to their respective desires. For Andalis, I think that was a sense of stability from his past tragedies, and for Laria, that was a connection to someone who she felt like could take care of her, given her past. So to anybody listening, at the risk of making this rather jumpy and murky at times, I would say, if you do choose to go down that path of like the Hillfolk kind of thing where you write it down, perhaps you can do it through the character's perception. How do they perceive each other? And then that'll make their aims with one another a little bit more clear.
Yeah, the aims can be something really specific, like you want a certain thing, or they can be really unspecific, like
Yeah.
you have a particular view of someone.
Mm.
And I do like the example of Indalis and Laria because that's something where they want something from each other, but it's quite an indirect thing. It's just what they want, sort of comfort and stability and assistance, and that's not the sort of thing that they could literally put into words.
Yeah.
And all this is really good because it allows your character to develop and further connect you, and it further connects you with whatever the central theme of your character is. In terms of the actual journey, like how you should behave when you're walking down the road to discover the magical thing, it really, you can improvise a little bit, you can improvise a bit more depending on your style. Just don't improvise so much that you detract from the entire thing. Again, I'd like to reiterate the fact that your sub-objectives should fit into the story rather than detracting from it. You shouldn't be having this entirely self-centered agenda that is going to completely derail the plot for everyone else. Your sub-objective should fit in with what's going on rather than completely stuffing it up.
Unless, of course, that has been planned, unless the
Unless
course
it's been
of the
planned,
story
yeah.
is going to be changed by the characters
Yeah.
in it, but that should also be planned out before. When you develop your characters in the story, perhaps also consider how will that force others to react, or in the case that they don't react, may break immersion, though that may just be for my own rather intense focus on realism.
And before we go, we'd like to just have a brief discussion of tone. So by tone, we essentially mean how the RP feels. Now, this is quite a loose term, but you can think about it in the context of a film. Like, if a film or a book is dark, or it's less dark, or it's humorous, or it's not. And this definitely applies to RP. So, for example, in Merit and my role plays, we generally do something equivalent to black comedy, where you've got quite a dark situation, but we somehow manage to have comedic elements at the same time. But you can also have there are people who like darker styles of roleplay, people who like lighter, more comedic styles of roleplay, etc., etc. But the important thing here is that the tone needs to be agreed on beforehand, either directly or indirectly. Because if you do not have a character that fits into the tone, it can disrupt things for everyone. Like imagine an action film where you've got two characters who are involved in this really intense political drama, and it completely detracts from what the film is supposed to be, which is basically just a slapdash Michael Bay style explosion fest. I'm saying this, like what we do, you can say fit comedy into a dark RP, but you need to do it the right way.
You can take advantage of the fact that the characters don't exactly fit into the situation they're being put in, but that also takes some forethought as well.
Yeah, so think about a Coen Brothers film like Fargo. That's a very dark film in some ways, but it's also got comedic elements. How does that work? Well, you need to ask the Coen Brothers, but there's a certain way of writing comedy where the comedy isn't so Seinfeld style that it can actually fit into a dark universe. But that doesn't mean that any type of comedy is going to. Some will, some won't, and you need to establish this beforehand.
So, in order to consider the character fits for tone, just to give an example of how to do it, think about the psychological profile of your character a little. So if your roleplay is rather dark, then consider what kind of character development that may force. If your character is fairly naive or generally lighthearted, Garn, you know Lashu, you remember him quite well, right?
Yeah.
So Lashu was my Pandaren, very sweet young lad, and he was often engaged with Garn's troll Hinuji in stories, and they, were a good dynamic together.
Yeah, they were.
So say that we're engaging in a longer term story. At some point, Lashu may see Hinuji do something that just completely overwhelms his worldview. If this is something you see happening with your character or any other similar situation, then I'd caution you as follows. Make sure that you can work the time needed, or just the space in the story needed, for your character to recover or develop or adjust to the changes that have been made in their life, so that you don't need to randomly continue and ignore the, forced maturity that's just been put on, like Lashu, for example, or however that may manifest itself in your roleplay. Just make sure that they're worked in properly. Again, this could be more detailed storyboarding or just through improvisation, but it's necessary either way.
On the subject of Lashu, it's really important to realize that we're not saying that just because your character is innocent or comedic that it can't fit into a dark story.
Of course.
What we're saying is that it can actually be really compelling to have an innocent or comedic character in a dark setting, especially when you contrast the innocence of a character like Lashu with a really dark character like Inuji, because that innocence and the reaction to the dark things that are going on from an innocent character can actually be really compelling in furthering the darkness. It's like if you've got a child witnessing an incredibly dark act, that act just seems all the more dark. However, the issue here is not with comedic characters. It's with comedic characters that are comedic in a very certain way. So the people I'd like to blame here, and I'm putting the blame on sort of quite a specific group, is, for example, people like Goblin and Pandaren roleplayers. Now, not all Goblin and Pandaren roleplayers are like this. There are a certain group of Goblin and Pandaren roleplayers who play their characters as stereotypes all the time. Goblins like money, 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 greedy, greedy, New York, etc. Pandaren like food. They're into food. They're just fluffy boys and girls. The issue with that is that when your character has no capacity to vary the way it behaves depending on the situation, it cannot fit into certain RP tones. If you are playing a comedic character like a Goblin or a Pandaren or whoever, make sure that when you move into a dark setting, your character, or if you're playing a dark character moving into a comedic setting, that you don't need to compromise the personality of your character, but you need to behave A, realistically, and B, in such a way that it doesn't completely derail the RP for everyone else, because you're going on about making profit while people are trying to have a genuinely serious story.
That, or accept the limitation of a character and just maybe choose a different character for that roleplay.
Yeah,
that's the reason that I don't, tavern roleplay on merit, because I cannot for the life of me think of a compelling reason that he would be there. And so I think what this all comes back to is theme. Gun, and I love our themes, and I think it's fair to say that for both of us, the thematic element of the stories is what makes it most valuable, because it's the most personal. So for me, I find that I achieve that best with a little more structure. For Gun, it's more freeform, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Given that this is starting to grow rather overworked, like many a roleplay campaign...
Like many of your stories.
Oh, I think this might be the place that we choose to conclude.
To anybody listening, we hope you have a good time in your debauched, awful, awful lives. Come find us on Wormrest Accord, where we will be busy AFKing in the tavern like everyone else. Except for Merritt. He doesn't go in there.